The global economy is in crisis and in danger of breaking down into a new Great Depression. This course will provide a comprehensive explanation of how this calamity came about. I'm Richard Duncan, the author of 3 books on the global economic crisis: The Dollar Crisis, Causes, Consequences, Cures, The Corruption of Capitalism, and The New Depression, the Breakdown of the Paper Money Economy. The first thing to understand is that the Great Depression and this New Depression, as I call it, originated and evolved in exactly the same way up until the time of the policy response. The origins of the Great Depression date back to World War I, when the classical gold standard broke down. In 1914, all the European nations went to war, but they didn't have enough gold to fight the war. So the European governments began issuing enormous amounts of government debt and financing that debt with paper money creation. Well, all of the debt and all of the paper money created during World War I, that led to a worldwide credit bubble that we call the Roaring Twenties. In 1930, however, that credit couldn't be repaid, and the international banking system collapsed, and global trade collapsed. Well, at that point, policymakers had no idea what to do. They believed in capitalism and laissez-faire, so they more or less just stepped back and let market forces reestablish a market-determined equilibrium. And that's what happened. The market did reestablish a new equilibrium. Unfortunately, that new equilibrium was at a level of GDP that was 46% less than it had been in 1929, and at a level of unemployment in the US that ranged from 15% to 25% for the entire decade. And during that decade of the 1930s, Germany became fascist and took over Europe, and Japan became fascist and took over Asia, and then World War II started. When World War II started, the United States government expanded its spending by 900%. That massive expansion of government spending, that ended the Great Depression. But unfortunately, World War II also ended 60 million lives. Well, this new depression has come about in exactly the same way. It originated when the Bretton Woods system broke down in 1971. Bretton Woods was a kind of quasi-gold standard. Afterwards, governments around the world began issuing enormous amounts of government debt again, and later they started financing that debt with paper money creation. That led to a 4-decade-long global economic boom without precedent. But then in 2008, that credit couldn't be repaid. And once again, the international banking system started to break down, and international trade started to break down. This time, however, the policy response was entirely different. This time, governments around the world are doing everything in their power to prevent market forces from reestablishing a new market-determined equilibrium, for fear that that new equilibrium would once again be at a level of GDP 30 or 40% lower than it had been in 2006. So governments have responded with trillion-dollar budget deficits, financed with trillions of dollars of paper money creation. And that's where we remain today. The global economy is on government life support. The purpose of this course is to explain why the world is once again at risk of complete economic breakdown. I'll begin by discussing the steps that were taken to restore economic stability after the Great Depression. I'll then describe the long series of US policy mistakes that led to the unraveling of that stability. And in particular, I'll explain how the abandonment of the core principles of economic orthodoxy, sound money, balanced budgets, and balanced trade, led to the creation of the greatest credit bubble in history, and how that bubble has transformed the world. Finally, I'll introduce an easy-to-understand analytical framework the quantity theory of credit, which I believe is very useful in explaining all aspects of this crisis, its causes, the rationale for the government's policy response to it, what's likely to happen next, and what that should mean for asset prices and asset allocation decisions during the months and years ahead. This crisis is far from over. Its causes have not yet been addressed. So if a solution is to be found, it's incredibly important that as many people as possible understand the issues involved and what's at stake. So thank you for joining me in this course. I hope you find it useful and interesting, and I look forward to your feedback.